This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Appreciate you taking the time to spend it with me here on New Year's Eve. You can follow me on Twitter at BHWeingarten. All right, we've been talking a bit about national security and foreign policy, as well as foreign influence. We've heard about the hysteria of foreign influence in the U.S., primarily from the Russians, but it also does exist from the Chinese and from all sorts of other malign actors throughout the world. One of those actors is Iran, and now their proxies. Very interestingly, Iran has built up a set of Sunni partners, and there are plenty of folks in American media and outside of American media as well, who, for example, were proponents of Iran deal and the Obama administration's policy writ large with respect to Iran and the Middle East. What was that policy? That policy was about enabling the building of a quote-unquote Shiite crescent, a land bridge that would allow Iran to become the dominant hegemonic player in the region. These folks, as you would imagine, have not been pleased by the Trump administration because the Trump administration's main actions in the region have been to counteract almost everything that the Obama administration did. For example, pulling out of Iran deal, reimposing crippling sanctions, building up an alliance of relatively secular, authoritarian, Sunni Arab nations as a bulwark against Iran and the Shiite crescent that they're trying to build. Not just those nations, but amazingly, an Israel-U.S. Sunni Arab partnership, something that most people thought they would never see in their lifetime. But that actually is the perverse positive, the perverse benefit of an Obama administration that tried to make Iran the strong horse in the region. Now, I mentioned foreign influence and Iranian foreign influence. How do we see that in America? Well, we actually see it in a media that not only cheerleads, but even, it appears, is a willing participant, is complicit in, whether wittingly or unwittingly, actual influence operations, information operations that happen to have the perverse, detrimental result for America, which is putting forth the Iranian position, pushing back on this alliance that has been built as a bulwark against it, and ultimately damaging our relationship with Israel, damaging our relationship with others who are vital to defending against the world's leading state sponsor of jihad in Iran. Where is this influence operation most acute? We see it in the story of Jamal Khashoggi. And up next, we're going to talk about that influence operation. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. We'll talk about that influence operation back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. All right, before our break, we spoke a bit about foreign influence operations, one of them being that of Jamal Khashoggi. And to give you a little bit more context here, Jamal Khashoggi was cast by the media as this liberty-loving, muckraking journalist from Saudi Arabia who was fighting the good fight against the authoritarian Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and as a result of his efforts was brutally butchered by that regime in Turkey in the Saudi embassy there. Some of us, including my next guest and his organization, as well as myself, questioned that official narrative, and suddenly, 2 months after this influence operation has had its intended effect, we now find that those who were cast as having smeared Khashoggi were actually telling the exact truth that the Washington Post has just printed where he used to write. Joining me now on the line is David Reaboi, Senior Vice President at the Security Studies Group. His organization has done tremendous work on the Khashoggi story. David, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Happy New Year.
Likewise, Happy New Year to you as well. So you contend that the entire Khashoggi story, and you were following this in real time, is in effect an information operation done effectively on behalf of the Qatari government, which is aligned with the Iranians, and thus this whole information operation has benefited the Iranians. Connect the dots for us.
Sure. Well, I want to give you a lot of credit too, because you and I were there at the very beginning as soon as this was breaking, and I think we both saw. Not a lot of people did. We both saw the stitches on the fastball coming at us, and we recognized this for what it for what it was. So I want to commend you on your great work on this as well.
Well, thank you.
But sure. But to be brief, we had in the Middle East, especially around these parts, where you don't have a real robust tradition of a free, inquisitive, nonpartisan press. You don't even have the aspiration for that. What you do have, you have basically agents of influence, or what people who would be called in another context, for lack of a better word, intelligence agents. And their job, some guys are spies, some guys do research, and some guys are journalists. That's just the cover that they wear. And they go sort of from place to place, from gig to gig, advancing the interests of their patron. And Khashoggi was a guy who did this and plied his wares. His wares were influenced through the medium of journalism, or writing columns, and he did it on behalf of Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He did it on behalf of the prior ruling clique in Saudi Arabia, specifically Turkey al-Faisal, and most recently he was doing it on behalf of the Qatari government. And it's kind of interesting how all of those particular patrons that Khashoggi had were sort of a similar Islamist stripe. Well, at some point over the last couple of years, this particular point of view, this Islamist persuasion of Khashoggi's, meets up against MBS and the new kind of reform movement that's going on in Saudi Arabia. And all of a sudden, Khashoggi is the odd man out. His particular sympathies for the Muslim Brotherhood put him far outside of what Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the young reformers in the kingdom want to go, or where they want to go with their society. They're very anti-Brotherhood, and they're also very anti-Iran. Now, Khashoggi was also anti-Iran, but he was very much pro-Brotherhood. So he was a bit of a free agent for a while until he found the Qataris, and the Qataris are major rivals and regional adversaries to the Saudis, and they bankroll and give diplomatic and other institutional support to the Brotherhood, and they have for the last 30, 40 years. And so Qatar was really a perfect home for Jamal Khashoggi. And sort of that brings us to his death, and his death at the hands of his believed to be Saudi agents, probably almost certainly Saudi agents inside Turkey. But the more we learn about this, the more it seemed like it wasn't so much a killing in cold blood as it was an attempted rendition. They wanted to bring him home. They wanted to bring him home from Turkey back to Saudi Arabia, and he didn't want to go. It seemed like there was a fight, a struggle ensued, and he died. Now that's a terrible thing. Sure, it's a terrible thing when anyone dies. But as I pointed out recently at security status in a new article at Security Studies Group, securitystudies.org, it's a far different story. A spy dying on the way to be sort of forcibly taken back to his home country is a far cry from the media narrative, which is that he was this wonderful, freedom-loving journalist who was just murdered because Saudi Arabia couldn't stand the idea of someone advocating for freedom, which, of course, is the narrative that both Qataris want to advance, and also the narrative that a lot of people on the left and the Washington Post want to advance. So we're in a kind of strange situation where Khashoggi was a Qatari asset prior to his death, and his death after his death, he sort of transmogrified again into a Qatari asset for use against the Saudis. Once he had departed his natural life. So it's an interesting situation. I think it's by far one of the big stories of the year for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and Time has made Khashoggi one of their people of the year, holding him up, and this is the part of this which is just purely cynical politics of journalists are under attack around the world, and here was someone who was writing in the U.S. for the Washington Post, and thus Trump is responsible, or Trump is somehow complicit because he's working with Mohammed bin Salman to defend U.S. national interest in that region, and Salman is portrayed as the butcher in all of this. But I want to go back to just the basic details of Khashoggi's background, and you raise a few of them. He was effectively a quote-unquote state journalist for the prior ruling clique in Saudi Arabia. He worked closely with Turki bin Faisal, who was the Saudi intelligence chief until just before 9/11, and then an ambassador after, so Khashoggi presumably traveled around with him as an advisor. And Khashoggi was an Islamic supremacist as well. How did he ever end up allowed into the United States in the first place?
This is an excellent question that nobody seems to know the answer to. I know a number of people at first, as we remember, the story was that he was a green card holder. And, I reached out to people that I know at DHS and others in government, and I said, hey, can you find out for me some of the details about his green card application and so forth? And the response was, hey, we don't know anything. And, and it quickly became clear that he was not a green card holder, but he was in this country legally somehow. And to this date, it's been several months, and we still don't really know the answer to who was the one that gave him a thumbs up, who was the one that allowed him to come in. And look, it's possible he came in a diplomatic way because he did. For a time, he did work at the Saudi embassy in Washington, so it's possible that he still had some type of diplomatic credentials, and he was a known guy around town. So it's reasonable to expect that there was someone in the bureaucracy or the intelligence community that kind of raised their hand to. On his behalf and got him in here. Regardless, somebody who hung out with the Mujahideen and bin Laden in Afghanistan should probably be looked at twice, if admitted at all.
This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. We'll pick up this conversation on Jamal Khashoggi just after the break. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We've been speaking with David Reaboi, Senior Vice President at the Security Studies Group, about the story of Jamal Khashoggi, one of the defining stories of 2018 in the view of the media, but actually it's defining because it shows the media being complicit in an information operation from hostile powers. Now, David, we were just talking about how Jamal Khashoggi was able to enter the United States in the first place. Regardless, he has been held up as a cause celeb and used on a bipartisan basis, in a sense, as a martyr, as a political symbol for the political establishment to impose its views on the Trump administration, essentially. What has been the impact of the death of Khashoggi? How has it been leveraged?
Sure. He's primarily the people who are sort of waving the bloody Khashoggi shirt, so to speak, fall into one or more of these categories, I think. The first is people who are pro-Islamist, pro-Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't mean that they are they're neither Muslim nor brothers, but they think that the best bet for the Middle East is to have, what they believe is, authentic Islamic democracy, which they think is Sharia law, and they think it's a, sort of positive development for the region. I think that's crazy. You and I think that's crazy, but this particular point of view is quite popular in inside the Beltway, and especially at CIA and some other intelligence agencies. So you've got that. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are pro-Iran and who still resent Saudi Arabia's role, together with Israel, in trying to convince the then Obama administration not to implement the JCPOA or the Iran deal. These guys, I think, specifically MBS and his particular young generation, understood very clearly and still do that Iran is a greater threat to their own stability and their regime stability, and also the stability of the Middle East than Israel is. So they allied together to combat the Iran deal. They failed in that regard, but the people who pushed the Iran deal very hard still harbor a grudge, and they would like to get back at the Saudis any way they can. So then there's a third group of folks who are hardcore fanatical Trump haters, and these people, take a look at the scene and they see Jared Kushner's very tight relationship with MBS. They see Donald Trump's first foreign visit both to Jerusalem and also to Riyadh, and they say, hey, the Saudis are close to Trump, therefore the Saudis are bad, therefore we need to attack them, sort of in every venue. And I think those three things sort of explain most of the people who are going into hysterics about this, which is, to be blunt, and it sounds, people who are not familiar with geopolitics, people who are not familiar with the Middle East, may think this is rather callous, but the truth of the matter is it's one guy who gets killed in the Middle East. And that stuff, that's like Tuesday. That's not something exceptional, and it's certainly not something that is cause to completely reorient our Middle East policy, which is what a lot of these folks would like to do. As I said, they would like to realign towards the Brotherhood, and they would like to realign towards Iran. And Saudi Arabia stands in between those two things and opposed to those two things. So obviously, folks who care about that are going to be taking their shots, and that's pretty much what we've seen over the last couple of months.
I'm going to throw in one more interested actor in l'affaire Khashoggi, and we've just got a minute and a half to talk about this actor. Turkey. This happened in a Saudi embassy in Turkey. Turkey has been increasingly aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, even the Iranians, even though they're not natural allies by any stretch. Based on what you've observed and what has happened in the world, including in Syria, with sort of a rapprochement between the U.S. and Turkey in some regards as partners, do you believe that there is a substantial Turkish leveraging of Khashoggi as well to their benefit, and what is that benefit?
Well, of course. I think, of course, that's true. Security Studies Group, my colleagues Nick Short and Brad Pattie wrote a kind of brilliant paper about this, tracking the way the Turks used the flow of information leaking out, sort of very deliberately and very strategically in order to extract maximum benefit and in order to generate the most pain for the Saudis as they did so. And we know that the Saudis and the Turks are and have been rivals, just as the Qataris and the Saudis have been. And of course, they want to take advantage. Now, you mentioned a rapprochement between the U.S. and Turkey. I'm not sure if that's really the case or if it's just sort of a temporal,
tactical,
kind of good feeling towards the Turks here. So that's yet to play out. I think if the president does indeed move closer to Turkey in a tangible way, then I think that's a terrible thing strategically, and it would be a horrible blunder that I would be surprised if John Bolton went along with that.
David, we're going to have to leave it right there. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be right back on the Buck Sexton Show in just a minute.